This is Lydia, and my story is going to freak you out. Like, share, and subscribe for more. It was 3:00 a.m., and reality was starting to feel like it was unraveling. I'm a college student, and by unraveling, I mean I was forced to cram an overwhelming amount of knowledge from pre-recorded online lectures in just 2 days before my final exam. That's where it all began. Around 3:00 a.m., I decided to take a break because my bleary eyes and foggy mind had slipped into a haze after nearly 12 hours of nonstop listening. The way my professor kept droning on about the word crepitus, followed by his description of the crisp, crackling sound every time he mentioned it, was driving me up the wall. It was as if he thought he was teaching idiots and needed to explain what crepitus meant every 20 times he said it in the lecture. I had almost started playing a game of fortune-telling, eagerly waiting during the lecture for the next time he'd repeat it. "When bone rubs against bone, you'll hear a cracking sound," the professor said in his thick South African accent, which made me laugh inexplicably every time I correctly predicted the moment he'd say it again and explain its meaning. I'd yell out loud in my apartment, raising both hands as if I'd just won the lottery. Each time I could barely hear what the lecturer said next, because my mind was practically delirious. The brain can only absorb so much information at once, and I had hit that limit hours ago. My processor was overloaded with information, but with the threat of failing the course looming, I had to keep listening. I quickly pulled myself together to hear what the professor was saying now. "All of you don't need to," and then the lecture recording suddenly became hilarious. The last word sounded heavily distorted, and the video froze on a frame where the professor's face was anything but flattering. I sighed, noting how many minutes into the video I was, and refreshed the page. But it was blank. No matter how many times I reloaded, there was only the university logo with a spinning circle around it. It was now 3:00 a.m., and I felt like the university's website crashing was the universe's way of telling me to go to bed. I stretched, deciding the universe was probably right, and let out a long yawn. But that yawn was what made me pause. Something in the air felt off, as if it was thinner than usual. I tried yawning again, and it felt like I hadn't gotten enough air the first time. A loud clunk behind me made me whip around. Yes, I live alone. It's just me here, and from what I could see in the apartment at that moment, it definitely wasn't just me. It was like a shadow on a pond, translucent but rippling and darker than the surrounding space. My mind instinctively pictured a human shape, and the clinking sound seemed like someone washing dishes. Then suddenly, the shadow vanished. Panicked, I got up from my chair and looked around my apartment. Aside from the bathroom, it's a simple open space with a bed, dining table, desk, and a small kitchen. I had placed a large mirror on the wall to make the place feel a bit bigger, and that's where my eyes went next. There I was, standing alone. But I had tied my hair up when I started studying, and I should have looked terrified like I'd just seen a ghost. The reflection, however, didn't match. In the mirror, I was wearing surgical scrubs with my hair loose down my back, staring at my reflection with a completely calm expression. Behind me in the mirror, a man stepped into view. I spun around in panic, scanning the empty space behind me, then heard the sound of the bed creaking as if someone sat down and the sound of shoes being taken off. I turned back to the mirror again. The man was gone, and the figure in the mirror was no longer me. It was a younger girl, a completely different person. She frowned, and after a single blink, the image shifted back to me, messy bun oversized sweater, wide eyes proving I'd just witnessed something utterly insane. My heart pounded, and forgetting my exhaustion, I spent a few more minutes wandering around the apartment with a small handheld mirror, checking for anything strange I could only see in the mirror. It took a long time to calm myself down. "It's probably just because I'm tired," I muttered aloud to steady myself. Maybe it's just a hallucination. Though not entirely convincing, it was the most reasonable explanation at the moment. After a few more minutes, I jumped into bed, pulled the covers over my head, and fell asleep. Waking up the next morning, I had no time to dwell on the strange incident because my anatomy and physiology notes had vanished. I have a habit of writing them on paper because it helps me remember better, and I was certain I'd left them right on my desk next to my laptop, but they were gone. I tore apart my tiny apartment looking for them, and though I found the exact notebooks I used for notes in my backpack, they were completely blank. The pages where I was sure I'd written my notes were just empty sheets. With the exam only 30 hours away, then 24 hours, then less, I survived that day on coffee and potato chips. This time, in the early morning, I still had some fuel in my tank. I was already filled with panic that day, but it felt like I could still cram more into it. I sat reviewing my hastily scribbled new notes, trying to ensure I understood action potentials in nerves. Then the air grew thin again, just like the day before. Glancing at my phone, it was exactly 3:00 a.m. My blood ran cold. I mumbled to myself while studying, but made no sound as my lungs kept inhaling and exhaling that thin air. I fell silent, listening, hoping no eerie shadow would appear in my apartment again. Suddenly there was a rustling sound behind me, like sneakers scuffing on a wooden floor. I leapt from my chair, turning to stare at my empty apartment. At least it wasn't coming from inside my place, it was outside. The sound of frantic clanging and horse hooves clopping on the pavement followed. I was used to the sound of cars, almost numb to the noisy traffic and distant screeching, but definitely not to horse-drawn carriages. The city I live in, Wahi, Texas, isn't huge and is surrounded by farmland. Occasionally, people drive tractors down the streets, but I'd never seen any horse-drawn carriages wander in here, especially not horses galloping at full speed at 3:00 a.m. I couldn't get to the window in time as it passed, but the space outside was completely strange, as if the thin air had shattered into dozens of transparent layers scattered along the street like individual rain clouds stretching across the prairie, pouring rain onto the fields they passed. It was like a shadow on a transparent film. I could see a horse pulling a carriage rolling slowly into the city. It seemed to overlay the neighbor's car parked across the street like two films stacked on top of each other, then vanished. The film rolled out of sight, and a group of rowdy men in flat caps staggered past. I couldn't hear the second carriage, but I could hear the men. They were closer to my window, translucent, passing through another car parked on the sidewalk. In my astonished gaze, the shift came like a warping, bending timeline. A Buick, which I guessed was from the 1950s, gleaming with a boat-like design and white-wall tires, drove up the road with a spare tire mounted on the back. It plunged through the warp. The asphalt turned to dirt, and the building across from my apartment vanished as if it had never existed, leaving only an unused vacant lot where it once stood. I blinked, and the Buick was gone. The slow-motion films of dark time passed, and the building across the street returned. Squinting down at the building from my third-floor window, I could swear the shop on the ground floor was a clothing store. But now, it had been replaced by a coffee shop at some point without me noticing. I stumbled back from the window, somewhat comforted that at least my apartment was unchanged. My new anatomy notes hastily written that day were still intact. Mustering my courage, I looked at the large mirror on the wall. It was just me, a girl who looked like she hadn't showered in 2 days, reflecting my actual reality. For the second night in a row, I convinced myself, telling myself that the coffee shop across the street was simply something I'd never noticed, or I'd mistaken it for the clothing store. I told myself what I'd just witnessed was merely a sleep-deprived hallucination, and Google confirmed it. I spent the next few minutes searching the internet, and it's called a hypnagogic hallucination. From what I understood, it's a type of hallucination that occurs when you're overtired and sleepy but still trying to stay awake. It made perfect sense. I just needed to sleep, and I'd be fine. Waking up near noon with only a few hours left before the final exam, I discovered while getting ready that the special watch my mom bought me before I left home for college was missing. It was special because the watch's design was like Thomas the Tank Engine. I remembered when my mom gave it to me. She explained that when I was little, I loved the Thomas the Tank Engine series. She bought it to reminisce about a child who was always running around, especially when facing the reality that I was about to live far from home for college. It was an awkward gift, but I cherished it as a way to remember my mom every day. Despite searching as frantically as I did for my notebooks, I couldn't find it. Instead, I unexpectedly found a framed picture on the wall of me dressed as Pikachu as a child, with a note from my mom about how much I'd grown since then. Weirdly, I was never a Pokemon fan, nor had I ever seen that photo before. As far as I remembered, I'd never dressed up as Pikachu either. I immediately brushed the thought aside, resolving to deal with it after the exam and return to my books and notebooks, trying to cram the last bits of knowledge from the previous week into my head. As prepared as I could be, I rushed to the bus stop. While doing so, I glanced at the ground floor shop of the building across the street again. It was definitely a coffee shop, not a clothing store. The round tables were neatly arranged on the sidewalk. I spent an extra second staring at it before running to the bus stop just before the bus arrived. I knew exactly where my exam room was because it was where I'd taken most of my other exams before. Arriving at the hallway 5 minutes early, there was no one waiting there, so I hurriedly entered the room. Have you ever faced the fear of thinking you missed an important exam? It's like a weight slamming into your chest. As I stared at the lecture hall, all the students were hunched over pens in hand taking the test. Only a few glanced at me as I froze. One of the proctors, an older woman I assumed was a teaching assistant with short hair, looked at me through her round glasses. She stood up from her chair, ushered me out of the room, closed the door behind her, and turned to me. "The rule is that students are not allowed to participate if they arrive late," she said. "If you have a valid reason, you need to speak with the professor." My mouth gaped like a fish out of water. I was clearly told the exam would start at 3:00 p.m., and it was even 3 minutes early. The teaching assistant looked at me with pity and let out a small tisk. "You should talk to Professor Jones," she said. "Maybe she can sort it out." I frowned, confused. "But my professor is et and void." "Who's Jones?" I asked. "And is this the Anatomy and Physiology 2 exam?" It turned out, according to the proctor, I had made a mistake. It was indeed an Anatomy and Physiology exam, but for Part 1. That meant instead of the time I had gone to the wrong location. Seeing that it was already 2:58 p.m., I hurriedly explained my mistake to the proctor while fumbling through my phone for the photo I took of the exam details. Under her disapproving gaze, I reviewed the photo I'd hastily snapped. It was indeed this room, and the time was correct 3:00 p.m., but it didn't matter anymore, not until I read the date. "Oh!" I gasped in the hallway in front of the proctor. "It's tomorrow." All my confusion was completely drowned by a wave of relief. I had wasted a bit of time coming here, but I hadn't missed anything crucial, and I still had plenty of time to review. A voice called out as I walked, laughing like a maniac wandering out of the university. "Clara." I looked around and saw Tim hurrying toward me, smiling and waiting for me. Tim and I had lived together in our first semester of freshman year to save on rent before deciding I needed a place with more personal space. However, since we still took the same bus route, we kept in touch. We sat next to each other on the bus, and Tim laughed when I told him about my exam mix-up. "You still have that habit of waiting until the last minute, huh?" he asked as the bus turned a corner, leaving the university behind. I shrugged. Not always, but I tend to panic when the semester starts, when everyone else already has their perfect notes, and I feel like I have to catch up or I'll fall behind. "But my grades are pretty good," I replied. "I'm pretty sure I did well on all the other exams this semester." "Oh," Tim said. "Don't stress too much. You'll pass the test." Tim raised an eyebrow, no longer teasing me about my study habits. Instead, he flashed a bright smile and said, "Guess what?" "Guess what?" I asked. "I got accepted for an internship." Tim beamed at me. "Pretty good, huh?" I was genuinely curious about his life after we stopped living together. Smiling and congratulating him, I teased, I guess, "good." Here means they don't make you clean for free, right? Tim's smile widened, as if he'd hoped I'd ask that. "I can't tell you yet," Tim replied excitedly. "Top secret. But it's really awesome." Tim was studying physics or engineering or something I honestly couldn't remember. Maybe this internship was a big deal for him. I struggled to believe he'd gotten into something huge and confidential because Tim was insanely smart. Back at my apartment, I set my notebook on the table and sat down. Having another day to study was truly a blessing, but honestly, I was sick of studying. The photo of me as a child dressed as Pikachu stared back at me from the wall. My brain was still pretty fried, and the more I looked at that photo, the less certain I was that it had ever happened. I started doubting my memory, which had always been reliable, but was now not entirely accurate. Maybe college had forced me to absorb too much information, and some memories were getting hazy. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just the studying, opened my laptop and started browsing the web. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly, just some stories about strange things happening mostly in Wahi. I scrolled through local websites and online forums, digging for anything that might catch my attention. Part of me knew I was just procrastinating from looking at those anatomy theories again, but then something stood out among everything I'd browsed. A single post on a forum was striking enough to grab everyone's attention. Has anyone had things go missing for no reason? Half my pots and pans and the vase my grandma gave me are gone like they never existed. I asked some family members, but no one remembers them. The post was only from that morning with very few comments, 2 vague, unhelpful replies, and a few comments asking if the poster lived with anyone, or if they might have sold or thrown them out without remembering. The author didn't respond to any of the questions. I spent some time deciding, then wrote a comment below saying I'd experienced something similar and asking if the author had found a solution yet. Then I dove back into studying, though I wasn't as focused as before. My mind wandered and my eyes kept drifting to the Pikachu photo. I checked the post about missing items multiple times, but no one else commented, and the author didn't reply to me either. At dinner, I was munching on a boring bowl of cereal and browsing the internet when I got a text from my mom. It was a simple message, just wishing me luck on my final exam tomorrow. I considered replying with a question about the Pokemon photo and the missing Thomas watch, but decided against it. My mom isn't great at texting, so it'd be much easier to talk on the phone. If I called her now, she'd ask what I ate for dinner if I'd slept enough, and whether I was leaving my studying until the last minute again. If I mentioned anything strange in my life, she'd worry and scold me for not taking care of myself properly. So I just thanked her and felt even more bored with studying. I decided to relax a bit by watching movies. Now I wonder if things would have been different if I'd gone to sleep. But my curiosity grew stronger as I watched one movie after another, my eyes glancing at the time in the bottom right corner of the screen, waiting for 300 a.m. Though I was pretty tired, strangely, I felt more awake and alert than the past 2 nights. If it happened again tonight, well, it'd be hard to chalk it up to hallucinations. The night grew late, and my curiosity turned into anxiety. It feels different when you're curious about something mysterious, while people are still bustling outside and different lives are going on as usual. But when the world falls asleep and the space becomes quiet, it's like the night has entered the witching hour, where anything could happen and no one would see. If my initial curiosity made me want to stay up until 300 a.m., the overwhelming anxiety ensured I had to. My eyes glanced at the clock more than at my movie, my heart pounding in my chest as the minutes ticked to 58, then 2:59. The movie's sound distorted and stopped entirely. The screen froze. I took a deep breath once again, feeling the air strangely thin. I could even sense with my touch that the fan spinning in front of me was producing weaker air. My eyes widened as I heard whispering behind me, then another whisper from what I thought was a different man responding slowly. My heart leapt into my throat. I turned around. 2 translucent shadows like the dishwashing figure from the first night, one tall and one short. I watched them pass by about 2 meters from me before vanishing into the wall. I quickly stood up from my chair and stepped to the window. At first, it was just a thin layer of fog settling over the street outside. There were also faint, hard-to-track shadows darting by. Then it shattered into an increasing number of those transparent layers. A blurry fire truck roared down the street with flashing lights, driving onto a dirt road followed by cars I guessed were from the 1970s, parked as if brand new. The sound of creaking shoes on the floor made me jump, spinning around to look at my apartment. The creaking, then the sound of a glass being lifted and filled at the sink, though no water was flowing, and the pouring sounded far more distant. There was no one there, not even a shadow. I tiptoed back to the mirror, pretty sure I didn't want to look, but needing to confirm. A woman in a long nightgown wasn't standing at my sink, but in a completely different room, as if it wasn't my apartment anymore. Connected to the wooden frame of the mirror was an entirely different room. It looked onto a large dining table and a kitchen straight out of World War II. In the distance, there seemed to be a living room with an old radio against a green wallpapered wall. I slowly turned around. Still, my tiny apartment, nothing changed. Alice in Wonderland. Huh? It was as if an entirely different world existed within my mirror, and it was still there when I looked again. The woman in the nightgown set the glass down, turned off the kitchen light, and walked into the living room behind her, never once noticing me in the mirror or anywhere else. She turned off the living room light too, making me blink at the sudden darkness. The mirror turned pitch black. During that time, I stood frozen with all the lights in my apartment already turned on earlier. I breathed the thin air, and then it was gone. The mirror returned to my reflection, my face looking like I'd just seen a ghost. This had to be real, because there's no way a hallucination would suddenly kick in at the same time every day like that. It was still 3:00 a.m. I blinked hard a few times, staring at the clock to make sure I wasn't mistaken, and it ticked to 3:01. On the third blink, I didn't try to go to sleep right away. Instead, I wandered around my apartment looking for things that had changed. There were indeed a few differences. My phone case was now green instead of the sparkly purple one I'd carefully chosen. The dishes had all been replaced with ceramic instead of fragile porcelain, and my favorite sweater, the one I wore to school yesterday, was gone. It wasn't until I woke up late the next morning that I realized the biggest change. After messing up the previous day, I wanted to ensure I'd get to the right exam room at the right time. I was never truly passionate about becoming a nurse, it just seemed like a good idea, so I pursued it without much thought. I could swear I'd never ever considered becoming a teacher. But when I logged into my university account, there were no anatomy and physiology classes listed. Instead, I was greeted with unfamiliar course codes for a teacher training program I was certain I didn't know about. I had planned to review one last time for the exam that morning, but instead, in a panic, I spent my time emailing and calling anyone who could help sort out this mess. The Student Affairs Office responded in confusion, insisting I was enrolled in education and had never registered for any nursing classes at this university. Professor Void, who taught my anatomy and physiology course, didn't answer his phone or emails, but a teaching assistant responded on his behalf. She had never heard of me and suggested I contact the Student Affairs Office. I felt like a puppet in some sick joke. It was insane talking to the teaching assistant who had seen me week after week in classes I attended, met me in person multiple times, and answered my questions about assignments only to tell me flat out she didn't know who I was. I still planned to attend the exam. It sounds absurd, but the mix-up with my program didn't align with reality. It took up a part of my brain I couldn't process. Honestly, I didn't believe it. Ignoring the emails, calls, and panic, I took the bus to campus, arriving at the correct exam room a full 15 minutes early. 3 o'clock struck, but no one showed up. No students from my class, no proctors. The room was empty, the hallway deserted. I stood there a bit longer, and time passed 3:10. In the chaos of loss, I couldn't comprehend it. Though my mind tried hard to connect the dots, it only grew more confused. I wasn't sure if I wanted to scream or sob, but I was certain I was both anxious and heartbroken, realizing that somehow I had failed the exam no matter what had happened. The Anatomy and Physiology 2 exam wasn't held here at 3:00 p.m., and I couldn't check where the actual exam was because my university account no longer listed me as enrolled in that class. It was like those nightmares where you haven't studied or overslept, except this nightmare was more detailed, more vivid, and I hadn't woken up. Stumbling out of the university building toward the scorching boulevard, my feet headed for the bus stop, but my mind couldn't make any decisions. At an outdoor dining table, I saw Tim studying with a group of other students. My feet changed direction, hurrying toward him. Tim. I called loudly, making him jump and look up with a frown. "Can I talk to you for a second?" He agreed, standing up and following me a short distance. "Tim," I said urgently, "I swear things have gone completely insane. Sorry, I know you're busy, but I went to the exam room and no one was there. It sounds crazy, but the world around me feels like it's changing." Tim's eyebrows furrowed and he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. But what class are you in? We can try to find where your exam is." My mouth fell open in shock. Had Tim forgotten me too? The way he spoke, the way he looked at me was completely unfamiliar. Tim, I sighed. Do you know who I am? He grimaced. Sorry, Tim replied. Do we have a class together? I didn't stay to hear the rest of his sentence. I ran my eyes blurry with tears racing to the bus stop. I cried silently the entire way back to my apartment, then broke down, sobbing the moment I closed the door. I always tried to be friendly with other students and a few neighbors, but I didn't really have any close friends. Tim was probably the closest person to me. My crying exhausted me, and eventually I stood up and sat at my computer. The notes scattered on my desk were all about English history and education written in my handwriting. All the university emails I scrolled through numbly sent or received before today were from professors and classes I'd never attended. Now I was more certain than ever that I had never dressed up as Pikachu. The author of the missing items post still hadn't responded, and there were no additional comments either. I thought about calling my mom, but hesitated, unsure what would happen if she suddenly didn't know who I was. What if my dad had died in this strange new reality, or my brother had never been born? Maybe things would be better if I just slept a long sleep. I forced myself to believe these strange perceptions were all due to exhaustion, clinging to that thought with the hope that everything would return to normal. Tired and sad, I just wanted to sleep because you can't process or worry about anything when you're asleep. I watched a movie in bed until I fell into a deep, restful sleep despite all the problems. When I woke up in my dark apartment, I was so glad for it. That feeling you get when you wake up after a deep sleep that nothing could be that bad gave me a lazy, indulgent attitude, not wanting to do anything but lie in bed and feel a carefree confidence. I didn't know when that good feeling started to break. The thought of nearly 300 a.m. had become a shapeless fear within me. I didn't want to check or acknowledge it. I lay there minute by minute, not bothering to look at the time until the air began to thin again. Tears welled up, streaming from the corners of my eyes and dripping onto the pillow. I shut my eyes tightly, not wanting to know, not wanting to hear, but I wasn't allowed to lie there and deny it. There was a loud noise, like the sound of a 1940s refrigerator door slamming and the sound of shoes creaking on the floor. The darkness scared me even more, forcing me to move. I leapt out of bed, grabbed my phone, and hurriedly turned on all the lights while my eyes stared at the clock striking 3:00 a.m. There was nothing there, not even a shadow. A second later, outside the window, I saw old cars pulling up the disjointed flow of time rolling down the street. I don't know why I punched the window, but I did. I wanted to scream, then dragged myself to stand in front of the mirror. The reflection was an old woman staring back at me, standing exactly where I was. I tried raising my hand, but the old woman in the mirror didn't. Panicked, I turned and ran out of the house. It was too much to bear. "Help me!" I cried. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. I dragged my heavy feet down the hallway, down the stairs, nearly falling, my mouth still screaming for anyone who could answer. Anyone who could make me feel less alone in this horrific situation. I reached the glass door of the apartment building's entrance. The time outside seemed to have changed. The unpaved roads and an empty lot where the building across the street should have been overlapped with a world where the building existed just like the old cars parked in front of it. Once again, this reality pressed down on the world that had birthed me. I don't remember when fear and despair turned into rage, but it happened. I flung open the glass door and ran outside. "Doesn't anyone see this?" I screamed at the world outside. "Am I the only one? What the hell is going on?" Still no one answered. I kept screaming as the pavement before me turned to dirt. I stumbled back from it, though during that time it was indeed dirt, but I could somehow tell it was still the concrete sidewalk. "Is anyone there?" I shouted again. The building across the street half vanished, and I could see it slowly returning to normal, but the other half was like a ghostly impression of a building on a barren field. A window on the upper floor, which I could see, flew open. "Shut up!" someone yelled down. "Or I'll call the police." A police car, like something from 1960s movies, suddenly appeared right in front of me. I gaped, staring, but the officer inside didn't seem to notice me, and then the car vanished. The world suddenly returned to normal. The shifting timelines of the night had ended, except the coffee shop across the street was now a bridal shop. My eyes welled up again. Sniffling, I brought the back of my phone where I kept the building's access card inside the case to the scanner near the apartment door and stepped inside. I just wanted it all to end, and my apartment was the safest place I could go. I was certain I hadn't locked the apartment door when I ran out, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. I was locked out. Angry and crying, I yanked and shook the handle, pounding a series of relentless punches on the door, wanting to smash the damn thing. I just wanted to lie in bed, immerse myself in movies on my laptop, and fall asleep while trying not to think about other things that might suddenly change or disappear. I couldn't break it. It was too sturdy, but while pounding on it, frantic and sobbing, the door suddenly swung open, making me stumble back. This was my apartment, my room number, my home, but by now it was no longer mine. I stared in shock. It was built exactly like my place. The kitchen layout was identical. The window and bathroom door were in the same spots, but the furniture was completely wrong, and there was no mirror on the wall. The guy standing at the door was staring at me like I was insane. "Are you okay?" he asked, wearing pajamas and raising his hands as if he thought I was about to attack. I wiped the bitter tears from my face. "This is my apartment," I told him. Another door down the hallway opened. It was Mrs. Hodgins from the next room. Her eyes flicked from me to the guy. "Bill, are you okay?" she asked. "Mrs. Hodgins," I said, though I already knew the answer. "Don't you remember me? This is my apartment." Hodgins glanced at me briefly before turning back to Bill. "Do you want me to call the police?" Bill took a second before nodding quickly to her, then turned to me. "What's going on?" "Why don't we sit down for a bit?" he suggested, as if struggling to make a decision. But I didn't want to talk, didn't want to hear that this was his apartment. I didn't want Hodgins to call the police and end up dealing with them. So I ran again until I couldn't run anymore. The only place I could think of was the university. I could walk there, though it would take longer than the bus. I could sleep in the common room or the library, get through the night, and then try to sort things out in the morning. Too exhausted to run anymore, I trudged slowly on bare feet, searching on my phone. I intended to find the post about missing items again, but it had been removed, or maybe it had never been there in this new reality. So I wandered the internet looking for any information related to Wahi, overlapping realities, or parallel universes. My eyes were glued to the phone screen, my hands frantically tapping, only glancing up to make sure I wasn't about to crash into anything until I heard a crisp, cracking sound. At first I didn't really pay attention to it, but it seemed like each step was bringing me closer to it. I was trudging along a road beside a barren field, and ahead was an old, forgotten building. It was small, made of stone with a flat roof and the word office carved above the door. It was a building I'd seen hundreds of times on my way to the university, like a relic of the Old West existing for no clear reason at the edge of the field. Every time I'd noticed it before, the old tiny building had its windows and door boarded up with plywood covered in graffiti looking abandoned. The graffiti was still there, but as I slowly approached, I could see the door was no longer sealed. The plywood had been replaced with a new metal door fitted with a keypad like an electronic lock. I was pretty sure the strange sound was coming from that building, distracting me from my breakdown. It wasn't exactly the cracking sound Professor Void had described. It was more like a distorted version of bones grinding together, but much louder. I stopped for a few seconds, listening to the sound coming from beneath my feet. The asphalt trembled with the noise, as if whatever was causing it was a massive grinding happening underground. The door of the old office building opened, and the crisp, cracking sound immediately grew louder. Instinctively, I ducked to the side, hiding behind a tree, hoping that with only moonlight illuminating me, I wouldn't be spotted. I wasn't sure why I was hiding, just a feeling that something was wrong, and I shouldn't be caught watching it. People filed out of the small building, more than a dozen, all college-aged. I peeked around the tree, mostly only able to see their limbs through the foliage. They were saying goodbye to each other, and before the metal door slammed shut, I thought I heard, amid the chatter, someone yell, "Bring it down slowly." Then the door slammed, cutting off the voice. The air grew quieter as it closed completely. The noise gradually fading and the ground's trembling slowed. Footsteps were heading toward me on the road. I edged farther, moving around the tree, glancing as the two people walked away. A guy and a girl. I squinted to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Walking on the road beside the unfamiliar girl was Tim. Both were walking together but didn't say a word, which was odd. They stood straight, staring ahead in silence. If I were walking with someone at 3:00 a.m. like that, I'd at least try to make conversation. I waited until their figures disappeared from sight before slowly stepping out, looking around to confirm no one was nearby, then quietly tiptoeing toward the old office building. It wasn't large enough to easily hold over a dozen students, let alone whatever they were bringing down. From the outside, it clearly wasn't big enough to house any machinery capable of making such a loud noise, even shaking the surrounding ground. The grinding had completely stopped as I approached, silently observing the small building, wondering if this office had anything more than an entrance to an underground space. I tried the metal handle, feeling like I was toying with something I shouldn't get close to. But why not? What did I have left to lose? The handle didn't budge, just like my apartment door was locked tight, and I had no idea what was inside. I shook it, then walked around the building looking for other clues, but on the surface it was just a small building. The windows were covered with plywood, and the only suspicious element was the metal door locked with a keypad. No one else came or went while I stood there hoping to find answers in an old stone building at the edge of a field. Maybe I should have asked the students who just came out, approached them on the street and demanded answers. But even now, I wasn't sure I wanted to be caught by anyone in that building. Top secret, Tim would definitely say if this was his internship. I hesitated a bit longer, but thought about being escorted away by security if I was caught, so I turned and hurried toward the university. I'm here now, sitting on a bench in the library, searching the internet on my phone, but it seems I'm the first to experience this situation. Though I've searched thoroughly, I can't rule out the possibility that if others like me exist, they're either dead or don't want to share. I'm not entirely sure about what I've found, but I'll write it down here. Wahi is a pretty simple place, mostly. 30 years ago, do you know about the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Europe? In the early 1990s, they tried to build a particle accelerator in Wahi called the Superconducting Super Collider, or SSC. It was designed to be 3 times larger and far more powerful than the Large Hadron Collider. It was meant to be the biggest and most powerful machine in the world. But the project lost funding, and in 1993, after part of it had been built, a tunnel still being dug beneath the city, the project was cancelled. There's no information about the underground tunnel since then, and according to the internet, it was completely abandoned long before I moved here, even before I was born. However, I found some additional information through SSC's open records, and one of them was a list of people involved in the project. Among them was the name of Professor Etten Void, who taught my Anatomy and Physiology 2 course. I checked the university's website and found he's listed as a biology professor. I looked up more about him, but he's just a scholar of human biology. So why was Professor Void involved in a defunct particle physics project? Top secret, maybe Tim is involved too, since he said that, but I quickly dismissed it as there's no evidence and it doesn't make sense. Is the lack of online information about what happened in that underground tunnel because it's top secret? I don't know. I don't have any answers. Maybe I'm just grasping at uncertainties. I'm sitting in the empty university library at 5:00 a.m. with nowhere else to go, not knowing why my life has been completely turned upside down. I could swear the university library was in the west wing of the main building, but I'm sitting in the east wing library, and my dad's name is no longer in my phone's contacts.
Thanks for watching this video. If you like this video, drop a comment below, and please like, share, and subscribe my channel.